Please come with me. My daughter needs a mum like you, he said. The words cut through the jeers of the crowd. He wasn't asking out of pity. He was a man cornered by death, a man holding on to the last flicker of a dying candle in a hurricane. His voice cracked, raw and torn, as he clutched the small girl in his arms. Her little body was a rigid plank of fear, her eyes wide and haunted, seeing ghosts no one else could. The little girl, Hannah, hadn't spoken a single word since they put her mother in the ground. Not one sound. The town doctor had shrugged, the preacher had prayed, and the neighbors had whispered. They all said the same thing. She might never speak again. Grief had locked the door to her voice and thrown away the key. But then, the giant bride, Sarah, the woman they had just laughed off the marriage auction stage, bent down. Her movement was slow, cautious, like she was afraid of breaking something already shattered. Her hands, calloused from a life of labor others couldn't imagine, pressed against her own chest, as if to hold her splintering heart together. And she began to whisper a lullaby. It was a song no one expected her to know. The words rose soft and broken, raspy with her own unshed tears, but her voice carried a strange power. It wasn't a performance. It was a promise whispered across the dusty yard, a thread of sound stitching the silence. The little girl in the rancher's arms went still, utterly still. Her head tilted, her haunted eyes fixed on Sarah's face. Her lips, pale and chapped, trembled. And then it happened. Like the groan of a rusted hinge on a door that hadn't opened in years, a sound came from the child's throat. A single, fragile word that cracked the world in two. "Mama!" The crowd gasped. A wave of shock silenced every last whisper and chuckle. The air grew thick, heavy, the child's eyes, filled with a desperate, impossible hope, locked with Sarah's. "Are you my angel?" The words tumbled out, stronger this time, a question that was also a prayer. Mama said angels are tall." Hot, stinging tears flooded Sarah's eyes. Just minutes ago these same people had mocked her, laughed at her, dismissed her as too large, too strange, too much, a monster, unwanted. But now, in the eyes of this broken little girl, she wasn't a monster. She was an angel. She was a lifeline. The rancher, Caleb, stepped closer. His own hand trembled as he reached out, not to touch her, but as if afraid she might vanish. "She hasn't spoken in months," he whispered, his voice thick with a pain so deep it was almost holy. "The doctors gave up. They say she won't last the winter." He took a ragged breath, his gaze shifting to the jagged, tooth-like mountains looming in the distance. "There's one chance, a place in those mountains. Healing springs. The old stories say they can bring back what's lost." His eyes snapped back to Sarah, and for the first time he wasn't just looking at her, he was seeing her, her broad shoulders, her steady, powerful stance, the sheer undeniable strength that radiated from her. "But the trail is brutal," he said, his voice dropping. "No man I know can carry her that far, that fast. Not me, not anyone." He paused, his eyes locking on hers. "But you were made for this." Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Every instinct screamed at her to turn away, to run, to hide from their stares. She could feel them, all of them, watching her, waiting for her to falter, waiting for the joke to land. The giant bride, playing savior. But the child's small, cold fingers clutched the rough fabric of her sleeve. So small, so fragile. A little bird with a broken wing, desperate for shelter from a storm. Caleb's voice broke completely. "Please," he begged, all pride gone. "My daughter needs a mum like you, not tomorrow, not someday. Now." A hush fell over the yard. The dust motes swirled in the golden light, the only things moving. Even the men who had pointed and laughed minutes before held their breath. The horse behind Caleb stomped impatiently, sensing the raw collision of fear and hope between these three lost souls. Sarah pressed her lips together, a hard white line. She thought of all the letters from potential suitors that had stopped coming the moment she'd enclosed a photograph. She thought of being told her strength was unladylike, her height unnatural. She thought of her own mother, long gone, who used to soothe her tears and say, "One day, Sarah girl, your size won't be a curse. It'll be the reason someone lives." She looked down at the little girl, who was now leaning her head against Sarah's chest as if the matter was already decided, as if she had found her angel and would not let go. And Sarah knew, with a certainty that shook her to her very bones, that she couldn't walk away. This was it. This was the day her mother had promised. In that moment, her arms, the arms that had been called monstrous, freakish, inhuman, closed gently, tenderly around the child. She lifted Hannah from Caleb's grasp as if she weighed no more than a feather. The girl didn't cry out. She didn't shrink back. She burrowed closer, her small body molding against Sarah's strength. The crowd didn't laugh this time. They didn't even breathe. Caleb's eyes glistened, relief and awe warring for space on his face. For the first time in months, his daughter was clinging to someone else, not with fear, but with faith. Sarah's broken lullaby had unlocked a door that grief had sealed shut. But as Sarah's arms tightened, a weight settled over her heavier than any boulder she had ever lifted. She wasn't just holding a child, she was holding a life that could flicker out at any moment. She was holding this man's entire world in her hands, and she knew, with a cold dread, that the journey ahead wasn't just about steep mountains and treacherous trails. It was about the risk of opening her own heart again, the risk of breaking in ways no body, no matter how strong, could ever endure. The girl whispered again, her voice faint but filled with a child's unshakable faith. "You'll take me to the springs, won't you? My angel?" Sarah swallowed the lump in her throat. The words scraped their way out, raw and heavy. "Yes, little one," she heard herself say, "even if it costs me everything." And for the first time in her life, her sighs didn't feel like a burden. It didn't feel like shame. It felt like destiny. The mountains clawed at the sky, their jagged peaks like the teeth of some great stone beast. Sarah tightened her grip on Hannah, holding the small girl pressed against the solid wall of her chest. Her arm was as steady as an oak branch, but inside, her heart was a trembling leaf. The child was lighter than a sack of flour, yet heavier than any burden Sarah had ever conceived of. Because this burden had a name. This burden had a soul. And if she faltered, if she fell, that soul would slip away like smoke in the wind. Caleb walked beside her, his boots grinding a rhythm into the dirt. His horse, laden with supplies, followed a few paces behind. He kept stealing glances at her, his expression a mixture of awe, gratitude, and a deep, gnawing worry that mirrored her own. This wasn't just a trek to a mountain sanctuary. This was a race against death. The road ahead was a long, cruel ribbon winding through canyons, across rushing rivers, and past dangers no one spoke of aloud. Whispers had already slithered through the ranches, whispers that someone didn't want them to reach those healing waters, someone who stood to gain everything if Caleb's daughter didn't survive. That night, they made camp at the edge of a wide, empty valley. A small campfire pushed back the darkness, its flames throwing dancing shadows across Sarah's face. She sat cross-legged, a mountain of a woman with a tiny, fragile girl curled against her like a newborn kitten. Hannah's breath was soft and uneven, a fragile rhythm against Sarah's own steady heartbeat. Caleb watched them from across the fire, his face etched with a pain and wonder that stole Sarah's breath. "She hasn't let anyone hold her since Martha died," he said, his voice barely more than the crackle of the flames. "Not even me. But with you, it's like she's known you her whole life." Sarah looked down at the child's pale cheek, the dark lashes resting against skin that seemed almost translucent. Her throat tightened. "It's not me," she whispered, her voice husky. "It's the song." Caleb frowned. "The song?" "My mother sang it to me. Her mother sang it to her." Sarah's gaze grew distant. "It's an old one. From the old country. Some songs. They remember for us, when we're too hurt to remember for ourselves." Suddenly, Caleb's eyes widened, a flicker of disbelief, then dawning recognition. "Wait," he breathed. "Martha. Martha used to hum that tune. She said it was her grandmother's, from over the sea." He stared at Sarah, truly stared, as if seeing a ghost. Who are you?" Before Sarah could answer, before she could even process the impossible connection that now hung between them, Caleb's jaw tightened. He stared out into the oppressive darkness beyond their small circle of light. A coyote cried out, high and lonely, a sound that made the hairs on Sarah's arms stand up. "There's something else you need to know," he said, his voice flat and hard. "This journey, it's not just against the sickness." He looked at her, his eyes dark with a grim reality. "The banker in town, Elias Pike. He holds the note on my ranch. He's been trying to squeeze me out for years." He picked up a stick and stabbed it into the fire, sending a shower of sparks into the night. "The contract has a clause, a cruel one, an inheritance clause. If my bloodline ends, if Hannah—" he couldn't say the word. "If she doesn't make it, the land, the house, everything, it defaults to him." Sarah's head snapped up. The cold dread from the ranch returned 10 times sharper. "So this isn't just about a sick child," she said, her voice a low growl. "This is about greed." "It's always been about her," Caleb said fiercely, his eyes blazing. "But for a man like Pike, greed is the air he breathes. He knows about the springs. And he's hired men. I've heard the talk. They're on the trail, to slow us down." He looked at the sleeping child in her arms. Or worse. The fire popped loudly, an exclamation point on his words. Sarah felt Hannah stir against her, murmuring a single, half-dreamed word. "Mama." Her arms tightened, a protective cage of muscle and bone. A low, dangerous rumble started in her chest. This wasn't just about a promise to a dying child anymore. It was a fight. "Then let them come," she said, her voice quiet, but humming with a power that made Caleb lean forward. "They wanted someone to laugh at. They wanted a monster." A grim smile touched her lips. "They're about to get one." Caleb met her eyes across the flickering flames, and for the first time she saw no doubt in them. No pity, no hesitation. Only a fierce, burning belief that shook her to her core. But far out in the darkness, just beyond the reach of their firelight, a shadow detached itself from the rocks. It had been watching, it had been listening, and it was waiting. The morning broke too quiet. A pale, sickly ribbon of light stretched across the prairie, painting the world in shades of gray. It was the kind of unnatural calm that comes before a storm, the kind of stillness that makes every nerve in your body scream that something is about to break. Sarah felt it in her bones. Calm never lasted on the trail. She shifted Hannah against her chest. The child's small hand was fisted in the fabric of her shirt, clinging even in sleep, as if some primal instinct knew the world was waiting to snatch her away. Caleb walked a few paces ahead, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, his hand resting on the worn leather grip of the revolver at his hip. They hadn't walked for more than an hour when Sarah's gut clenched into a hard knot. The silence was wrong. It was heavy, suffocating. The birds were gone. The usual rustle of prairie dogs and rabbits had been replaced by a dead, listening stillness. She knew this sound. Back in the city, the factory alleys went quiet just like this, right before the gangs cornered their prey. She stopped dead, her free hand clamping down on Caleb's shoulder like a vice. Wait. Her voice was a low whisper. We're not alone. The words had barely left her lips when the world exploded. A shot cracked through the morning air, sharp and violent. Caleb's hat snapped back from his head. A neat, smoking hole punched through the brim. He didn't hesitate. He dove, grabbing Sarah and the child, pulling them all down into the dust. The horse shrieked and reared as men rose from the rocks that lined a nearby ridge. 5 of them, rifles in their hands, scarves hiding the bottom half of their faces. They moved with a lazy confidence that made Sarah's blood run cold. "Hand over the girl, rancher," one of them barked. His voice was flat, cruel, the voice of a man doing a job. "Boss says she don't make it to the mountains." A fire ignited in Sarah's veins. She rose to her knees, a towering figure of fury, the child pressed tight against her. Hannah was awake now, whimpering, her small body trembling. "Over my dead body," Sarah snarled. The men laughed, but it was a brittle sound. There was a flicker of uncertainty in their eyes. No woman they'd ever seen looked like her. Shoulders as wide as a barn door, arms as thick as fence posts. She didn't look like a target. She looked like a challenge. Caleb, crouched low, hissed, "Sarah, don't. If you run, you'll never make it. They'll shoot her first." Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror and rage. She could feel Hannah's quick, shallow breaths against her skin. She thought of the lullaby, the impossible connection. She thought of her mother's words. Your sighs will save someone one day. This was the day. In one fluid motion, she pressed the terrified child into Caleb's arms, locking eyes with him. Her voice was steel. "Take her! Run for the canyon! Don't look back, no matter what!" "Sarah, what are you—" He never finished, because Sarah surged forward like a tidal wave. A boulder, half buried in the prairie dirt, became her weapon. With a guttural roar, she ripped it from the earth, soil and roots cascading down her arms. It must have weighed 300 pounds. Bullets sparked and whined against the stone as she charged, the very ground trembling under her strides. The hired guns cursed, their aim faltering at the impossible sight. She didn't slow. She swung the massive rock like a battering ram, smashing it into the nearest man and his horse. The sound of the impact was a sickening crunch of bone and flesh. Man and animal went down in a tangled, screaming heap. "Move, Caleb!" she roared, her voice echoing off the rocks. This time, he didn't hesitate. Clutching Hannah to his chest, he sprinted for the narrow opening of the canyon behind them. The remaining men tried to draw a bead on him, but Sarah was a whirlwind of destruction. She was everywhere at once, shoving, striking, her fists landing like sledgehammers. She grabbed one man by the collar of his coat and threw him bodily into another, their rifles clattering uselessly to the ground. But for everyone she knocked down, another scrambled back, circling her like wolves hunting a bear. She was bleeding from a graze on her arm, her chest heaving. But she didn't stop. She couldn't hold them forever, and she knew it. So she did the one thing they didn't expect. She stopped fighting. She planted her feet in the middle of the trail, her broad frame a living wall blocking their path to the canyon. Her arms hung at her sides, her knuckles bloody. She was daring them. "You'll have to kill me to get to that child," she said, her voice dangerously calm. For a heartbeat, the men froze. No one moved. The sheer, unyielding certainty in her eyes gave them pause. Then a new voice drifted down from the ridge, smooth, cultured, mocking. Well, well, the giant bride they all laughed out of town. Sarah's stomach turned to ice. She knew that voice. Elias Pike, the banker, sat tall on a fine black horse, a gleaming rifle resting casually in the crook of his arm. He wasn't wearing a scarf. He wanted them to see his face. He wanted them to see the smug, greedy triumph in his eyes. "Seems you've found yourself a purpose after all," he drawled, his lips twisting into a smirk. "Step aside, Sarah. That child is not your blood. She's just collateral, a means to an end. You walk away now. You'll be saving yourself a world of pain." Sarah's jaw clenched so hard she felt a tooth grind. Her voice was steady, a low flame in the cold morning air. "You don't understand," she said. "She is my blood now. She's every reason I was ever born this way." Elias Pike's smirk vanished. His eyes went cold and flat as a snake's. "Then you'll die this way." He raised his rifle, the dark hole of the barrel fixing on the center of her chest. Sarah didn't flinch. She didn't even breathe. She took one step forward, the dust swirling around her worn boots. Her eyes locked on his. She could hear Caleb screaming her name from the mouth of the canyon, but she didn't turn. This was her stand. This was her purpose. The sharp crack of a rifle echoed through the prairie, but it wasn't his. One of Pike's own men, standing near the ridge, suddenly gasped and collapsed, a dark stain blossoming on his chest. From the rim of the canyon, Caleb stood exposed, his own rifle smoking, his face a mask of pure, blazing fury. For a split second, chaos erupted. Pike, shocked, fired wildly as his remaining men scrambled for cover. Bullets flew, horses screamed, and dust blinded the air. In that moment of confusion, Sarah moved. She snatched up a fallen rifle, and using it like a club, she cleared a path back towards the canyon. She and Caleb fought shoulder to shoulder, a desperate, unlikely pair. He was a quick, precise shot. She was a force of nature. Together, they were terrifying. The surviving hired guns broke and ran, dragging their wounded with them, their confidence shattered. Elias Pike retreated last, reining his horse back, his eyes never leaving Sarah. His voice, filled with venomous hatred, carried through the dust. "This isn't over. That mountain won't save her, and it sure as hell won't save you." Then silence. The only sounds were their own ragged breaths and the terrified whimpers of the child. Hannah was clutching Sarah's neck, her face buried in her shoulder. "Don't leave me, Mama," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Please don't leave me." Sarah's chest heaved. She pressed her lips against the girl's hair, the scent of gunpowder and fear filling her lungs. "Never," she whispered back, the word a sacred vow. "I will never leave you." But in her heart, a cold stone of certainty settled. Elias Pike was right about one thing. This wasn't over. The mountain still waited. And now, she knew for certain, so did he. The trail into the mountains became a knife's edge, squeezing them between walls of cold gray stone and a sky that seemed to be shrinking. The air grew thin and sharp, smelling of pine and impending snow. It carried the constant, distant roar of rushing water, a sound that spoke of depths and unstoppable forces. Sarah's boots bit into the treacherous dirt path. She carried Hannah pressed tight against her, a small, warm weight that was both her reason and her terror. Every step was a battle. Not because of the child's body, which felt lighter and more fragile by the hour, but because of her breathing. It was growing shallower, a tiny, fluttering rhythm that threatened to stop with every gust of wind. Caleb walked so close behind her that she could feel his breath on her neck. His hand was a constant, steady pressure on the small of her back whenever the path sloped too steeply. His face was a mask of exhaustion and raw fear, carved into sharp angles by sleepless nights. The higher they climbed, the more Hannah shivered, her lips turning a pale, bluish color. Her little fingers were tangled in Sarah's braid, clutching it like a lifeline. Sarah whispered the lullaby, the strange, shared song of their mothers. She sang it again and again, her voice trembling with cold and fatigue, but refusing to break. Each note was a prayer hurled against the uncaring stone. Each verse was a desperate attempt to hold Hannah's fading spirit inside her fragile body. On the second night, they made camp on a narrow ledge, huddled beneath a stunted, wind-twisted pine. Caleb's hands shook so badly it took him 3 tries to light the fire. As the weak flames flickered to life, Sarah cradled Hannah, rocking her gently, trying to share her own body heat. The girl stirred, her eyes glassy with fever. "Mama said, 'Angels are tall,'" she whispered, her voice so faint that Sarah had to lean in, her ear almost touching the child's lips. "You'll carry me home." Sarah bit down hard on her lip, tasting the coppery tang of blood. She wanted to say yes. She wanted to promise everything would be all right. But the truth was a claw tearing at her throat. What if she couldn't? What if this mountain, this cursed trail, took the girl before they ever saw the springs? What if she failed the only person who had ever looked at her and seen an angel instead of a monster? Caleb crouched beside them, his rough hand brushing first Hannah's feverish forehead, and then, hesitantly, Sarah's arm. "You've already done more than anyone thought possible," he said, his voice a raw rasp. "You gave her back her voice. You gave us hope. That's more than I could have done." Sarah shook her head fiercely, a violent, desperate motion. "Hope isn't enough," the words tore from her. "Not if she dies in my arms." Her voice cracked, breaking on a sob she couldn't contain. "Caleb, I can carry wagons full of timber. I can haul cattle out of mud pits. But I don't know if I can carry a life across death's door." He looked at her then, his eyes burning in the firelight with an intensity that went far beyond gratitude. It was something else, something deeper and more terrifying. "Sarah," he said softly, "you don't see yourself. Not the way I do. You think your size, your strength, is your only gift. It isn't." He moved closer, his hand still on her arm. "It's your heart, the size of it. That's what's keeping her alive right now. That's what's carrying both of us up this mountain." The words should have hurt. They should have been another reminder of how different she was. But they didn't. They sliced through the cold and the fear, leaving a strange, spreading warmth in their wake. A warmth that frightened her. She hadn't asked for this man's faith. She hadn't asked for the sharp ache she felt every time his hand brushed hers, or the way her breath hitched when his eyes lingered on her face for too long. She was supposed to be a tool, borrowed strength, a temporary shield for a dying child. But somewhere between the first broken lullaby and this desperate night on a cold mountain ledge, she had become something more. And that thought scared her more than Elias Pike and all his hired guns. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed from the cliffs above them. Not a rifle shot. Something else. The sound of splintering wood. The horse screamed, rearing against its tether, its eyes white with terror. Caleb snatched his rifle, spinning around. Sarah rose instantly, pulling Hannah tight against her, her body becoming a fortress. From the shadows of the pines just above their ledge, two figures emerged. Their faces were grimly familiar. Two of Pike's men. The ones who had run. "Boss says you've gone far enough," one of them sneered, stepping onto the ledge. His rifle glinted in the firelight. The other man held a heavy wood axe. Sarah now understood the cracking sound. They must have been cutting a new path down the cliff face to get ahead of them. "This is the end of the line," the first man said. "Hand over the girl, and maybe we'll let you two walk back down this mountain alive." Caleb lifted his rifle, his voice low and steady as the stone beneath his feet. "You'll take her over my dead body." Sarah's pulse hammered in her ears. She could feel Hannah's weak, frantic breaths against her collarbone. She heard the girl's faint whimper as the fire spat a shower of sparks into the night. She glanced from Caleb's resolute face to the cruel sneers of the hired guns, then to the sheer black drop of the cliff just inches behind her. And in that instant, she knew. This was no longer about whether she was strong enough to carry Hannah. This was about whether she was strong enough to fight fate itself. Before Caleb could protest, she shifted the shivering child into his arms. "Protect her," she whispered, her voice an urgent command. "Sarah, no." but she was already moving, rising to her full, imposing height. She stepped between Caleb and the guns, her shadow cast huge and unyielding against the rock wall by the firelight. Her voice didn't whisper. It rang out like thunder, echoing off the cliffs. "You want her? You'll have to break me first." The men hesitated, their rifles wavering just slightly. They remembered the boulder. They remembered her fists. One of them spat on the ground, a futile attempt to mask the fear in his eyes. "You're just one woman." A slow, terrible smile curled Sarah's lips. It held no humor, only promise. "Then you're already dead." The mountain seemed to hold its breath. The wind died. Caleb's finger tightened on the trigger. Hannah whimpered in his arms, and Sarah braced herself, a living shield of flesh and bone, knowing this fight would either save them all or end everything, just a stone's throw from the healing springs they might never reach. The final climb began in the pre-dawn blackness, a world made of nothing but shadow, frost, and the burn of exhausted muscles. The mountain was no longer a distant threat. It was a vertical wall of stone looming over them, its peak crowned in mist, its cliffs echoing with the roar of waterfalls they still couldn't see. Sarah's breath plumed in the frigid air. She pressed Hannah closer, trying to shield the child's frail body from the biting wind. Her own body was trembling now, not from weakness, but from the crushing, relentless weight of love and fear. The girl's skin was on fire with fever, her small chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven flutters. Time wasn't just running out, it was gone. Caleb was a ghost at her side, one hand pressed firmly to her back, the other gripping the rifle that had become a permanent extension of his arm. His face was gaunt, his eyes bloodshot and haunted. Yet every time Sarah's foot slipped on a patch of ice, his hand was there to steady her. And every time he swayed from exhaustion, she leaned into him, lending him the strength of 10 men. They were no longer a rancher and a hired stranger. They were two halves of a single, desperate will, bound together by the fading life they carried between them. The path narrowed until it was nothing more than a jagged scar carved into the rock face. 1,000 feet below, a canyon yawned, a terrifying abyss filled with swirling mist and the thunder of crashing water. Sarah shifted Hannah higher in her arms, her boots sliding on loose gravel. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The child's weight, once a comfort, now felt like a fragile, sacred promise she was about to break. Caleb moved ahead, inching along the ledge, his back pressed to the rock wall. He reached his hand out behind him for her. His voice was low and steady, a lifeline in the roaring emptiness. "One step at a time, Sarah. Don't look down." But for one heart-stopping second, she did. She looked down, and the world fell away. Fear, cold and absolute, punched the air from her lungs. The drop was endless, the mist a hungry mouth waiting to swallow them whole. Her knees buckled. A wave of dizziness washed over her. Hannah let out a weak, pitiful whimper. "Sarah!" Caleb's voice was sharp. She forced her eyes up, away from the abyss, and locked onto his. She focused on the rough, wind-burned lines of his face, on the grief and fear in his eyes, and on something else she saw there. Unshakable belief. In her. That's when the ledge broke. The rock beneath her right foot simply crumbled into nothing. With a grinding shriek, it plunged into the canyon below. Sarah lurched sideways into the open air, a scream tearing from her throat. She clutched Hannah tight, twisting her body to shield the child from the impact she knew was coming. But it never came. Caleb lunged, grabbing her arm with both hands. His boots scraped for purchase, his body straining against her weight and momentum. For a terrible second, they both teetered on the brink, a human pendulum swinging over oblivion. Then, with a desperate roar that was more animal than human, he pulled. He hauled her back from the edge, back onto solid ground. They collapsed together against the rock wall, breathless, terrified, and miraculously alive. Their eyes were locked, chests heaving. "I told you," he whispered, his voice a ragged, broken sound, "not to look down." By the time they cleared the ledge and staggered into the high meadow, Sarah's arms were screaming, her legs were numb, and her heart felt like it had been beaten with hammers. But ahead of them, it was there. The springs, shimmering pools of turquoise water, fed by steaming waterfalls that tumbled down moss-covered rocks. The mist rising from the pools glowed in the pale, ethereal light of dawn. The air was warm and smelled of wet earth and life. The place felt ancient, holy. But Hannah was limp. Her head rolled weakly against Sarah's chest, her eyes half closed. "No," Sarah breathed. "No, no, no, not now, not after all this." She stumbled forward, falling to her knees at the edge of the largest pool. With hands that trembled uncontrollably, she lowered the child's still body into the shallow, blessedly warm water. The steam rose around them like a prayer. Sarah cupped the water in her massive, calloused hands, pouring it over Hannah's face, her hair, her lifeless limbs. She began to sing the lullaby, but her voice broke into raw, wrenching sobs. Caleb knelt beside her, his own composure shattered. One hand rested on Sarah's heaving back, the other trembling as he reached out to touch his daughter's ashen cheek. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. The child's chest was still. The silence of the meadow was absolute, heavier and more terrible than any sound. "Please," Sarah begged, pressing her forehead against Hannah's, her tears dripping into the healing water. "Please, little one, don't leave me. Don't leave us. Take my strength. Take all of it, just don't go." And then, a flicker, the faintest flutter of the child's eyelids. Hannah's chest rose, a tiny hitching motion. Her lips parted. A small, weak cough escaped. Then another, stronger one. And then a thin, wavering cry that shattered the morning air and remade the world. Sarah gasped, pulling the child into her arms, holding her close, feeling the life, the warmth, the impossible miracle surging back into the small body. Caleb finally broke, tears of relief and exhaustion running freely down his face as he wrapped his arms around both of them, burying his face in Sarah's hair. "She's breathing," he choked out. "God, Sarah, she's alive." Hannah opened her eyes. They were no longer glassy or clouded with fever. They were clear, bright. And they were looking right at Sarah. Her voice, no longer a faint whisper, but a clear, sure sound, filled the space between them. "Mama!" The word struck Sarah like a bolt of lightning, not of pain, but of pure, blinding sunlight. She clutched the girl tighter, her own tears of joy falling into the sacred spring. Caleb leaned close, his hand moving from her back to cup her cheek, his thumb gently wiping away a tear. His voice was low, reverent, shaking with the weight of everything they had survived. "You saved her," he whispered. "You saved us both." He took a deep, unsteady breath. "And you need to hear this. Back at the ranch, I didn't just ask you to come because she needed a mum." His eyes bored into hers, filled with a raw, vulnerable truth. "I asked because I did. Because I need you." The world seemed to still. The water steamed around them. The mountain peaks stood sharp and clean against the new day's sky. "Stay, Sarah," he breathed. "Not as a hired hand, not as a temporary savior, as my wife, as her mother. Stay with us." Sarah stared at him, her heart pounding a wild, triumphant rhythm. All her life, she had been too much, too tall, too strong, too different, rejected, mocked, and dismissed. But here, in this man's eyes, held in this small, fierce circle of love, she wasn't too much or too little. She was exactly what was needed. She was everything. Her voice trembled, but her answer was as solid and sure as the mountain around them. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Caleb. Yes." He pulled her into a kiss, a kiss that tasted of tears and wood smoke, and a love bigger than any mountain. Hannah, safe and warm between them, let out a small, happy giggle. Their little family, forged in desperation and baptized in a miracle, wrapped in the steam and the light of the healing springs. But as they held each other, a shadow fell over the pool. A touching reunion. The voice was slick with venom. I must admit I'm disappointed. I was hoping for a more tragic ending. Elias Pike stood at the edge of the clearing, his rifle aimed not at Sarah or Caleb, but directly at the small, smiling child in their arms. His face was a twisted mask of hatred, his plan shattered, his greed curdled into pure evil. The deal was that the bloodline ends, Pike hissed, his eyes glittering. I'm just here to see the terms of the contract are met. He smiled, a cold, dead thing. This is over. But Sarah slowly rose to her feet, placing Hannah safely behind her. She looked at the banker, at his fancy clothes and his expensive rifle, and for the first time, she saw him not as a threat, but as something small, petty, weak. You're right, she said, her voice a low, rumbling promise of justice. It is. The story of what happened next would be told around campfires for a generation, how the giant bride, fueled by a love as fierce as any storm, moved faster than any man could believe, how she didn't need a boulder this time, how she used the mountain itself, the water, the stones, to disarm and subdue the banker without throwing a single punch, leaving him bound and weeping by the very springs he sought to defile. They rode down that mountain not as three broken souls, but as a family, strong and whole, bringing a defeated devil back to face the town that had once laughed at them. Sarah held a child who called her Mama, and rode beside a man who saw her as the angel she was always meant to be. And for the first time in her life, she felt small, not in shame, but in the shelter of a love so vast and powerful it could move mountains. If you believe a person's greatest weakness can become their greatest strength, hit that subscribe button. And let me know in the comments, what do you think happened to Elias Pike when they got back to town?